What started as an ordinary grocery run turned into a moment no one would forget. On a quiet Wednesday afternoon, in a peaceful suburb of Austin, Texas, the local grocery store moved to the familiar rhythm of daily life. Mothers balanced shopping lists. Retirees took their time browsing the aisles. Cashiers shared friendly small talk with regular customers. The warm scent of freshly baked bread and citrus filled the air as carts rolled over polished tile floors. But then, the unexpected happened. An elderly woman turned to a young black man and spoke words that cut through the air like a blade. "Go back where you came from." The entire store fell silent. All eyes turned to him waiting, wondering how he would respond. What he said next didn't just break the silence. It left an impact that no one could ignore. This is a story about strength, dignity, and the power of words. Stay with us, you won't want to miss this. Near the produce section, an elderly woman, probably in her late 70s, adjusted her bifocals as she eyed a bag of Granny Smith apples. She wore a pale pink cardigan, neatly buttoned up, and her silver hair was pinned into a tidy bun. But despite her grandmotherly appearance, there was an edge to her, a quiet impatience, simmering beneath her carefully composed exterior. A few feet away, a young black man named Jordan strolled toward the fruit display. He was in his mid-20s, tall, lean, and dressed casually in a gray hoodie and jeans. His AirPods were in one hand holding his phone as he absent-mindedly scrolled through messages, the other balancing a basket filled with groceries. He moved with the ease of someone who had done this 100 times before. Just another ordinary errand, on an ordinary day. And then, without warning, the moment that changed everything. Jordan reached for a bag of oranges, just as the elderly woman muttered something under her breath. At first it was too low to catch just another passing comment in the background noise of the store, but then, she repeated it, louder this time, her voice, sharp enough to cut through the soft hum of grocery store chatter. "You people should go back where you came from." For a second the world seemed to pause. The soft beeping of registers, the rustling of plastic bags, the quiet conversations between shoppers, it all faded into a heavy silence. All eyes turned to Jordan. What he did next would change the atmosphere of the entire store. The elderly woman's posture stiffened as she finally took notice of Jordan. Her expression shifted suddenly rigid, her lips pressing into a thin, unforgiving line. Her eyes scanned him, scrutinizing, judging. Then, with a sharp inhale, she spoke. "You people don't belong here," she said, her voice deliberate, loud enough to ensure those around them heard every word. Jordan's fingers hovered over his phone, frozen mid-text. His head lifted slowly, his brows drawing together. Before he could react, she continued, her voice edged with something bitter and unwavering. "Why don't you go back to Africa, where you came from?" The air thickened, the weight of her words settling into the space between them. A few shoppers nearby stiffened, their casual browsing forgotten. Some stole uneasy glances at Jordan, while others turned away, feigning distraction. Suddenly more interested in the cereal aisle or the nutritional facts on a carton of milk. The usual rhythm of the grocery store, the beeping of registers, the hum of quiet conversation, the shuffle of carts seemed to stall. Jordan blinked, as if trying to process what he had just heard. His grip on his basket tightened. His initial reaction was a flicker of shock, his jaw tensed, his breath caught in his chest. For a split second, it looked like he might fire back immediately, but he didn't. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate breath. His face remained unreadable, his gaze steady, calculating. The heaviness of the moment pressed against him, but he didn't let it show, not yet. The woman, still clutching her apples, didn't flinch. She stood her ground with an air of certainty, as if daring him to retaliate. There was no hesitation in her stance, no trace of regret in her expression. Nearby, a young mother clutched her child's hand a little tighter before quietly guiding them away. An older man near the potatoes shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Jordan and the woman, waiting, bracing, unsure of what would happen next. The silence between them grew denser, stretching across the store like an invisible force, pulling everyone's attention to the space between Jordan and the woman. Jordan's fingers flexed around the handle of his basket, and then, with the weight of every watching eye upon him, he made his choice. A young grocery clerk stacking bananas a few feet away froze, his hand hovering over a bundle of fruit. His expression was tense and certain. Should he step in, say something, or just pretend he hadn't heard? At the front of the store, a cashier stretched her neck, trying to catch a glimpse of the unfolding scene. The crowd around them wasn't closing in, but they weren't walking away either. They lingered hesitant, unsure, yet unable to ignore what was happening. Like it or not, they were witnesses now. Jordan held the woman's gaze, his expression calm, but behind his eyes, thoughts fired like lightning. 100 possible responses rushed through his mind. He could snap back, yell, demand she explain herself. He could walk away, let it slide, pretend it didn't bother him. But none of those options felt right. Instead, he took a slow, steady breath. He adjusted the weight of his grocery basket in his hand, his shoulders squaring. He didn't shrink under the pressure. If anything, he seemed to take up more space, his presence expanding in the silence. And then, he spoke. "Ma'am," he said, his voice even, unwavering. "Do you even realize what you just said?" It wasn't a challenge. Not exactly. There was no anger in his tone, only something firm, measured, a question, an invitation for her to think. But she wasn't interested in thinking. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice sharp, rising above the quiet murmur of the store. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." That was it. A woman near the bakery aisle gasped. Someone else exhaled sharply, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. The background noise of the store, the beeping of registers, the distant chatter seemed to dim under the weight of the moment. And yet, Jordan didn't react the way she expected. He didn't flinch, he didn't step forward or raise his voice. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them, let her words settle into the ears of every shopper within earshot. Then, after a long pause, he nodded slowly. "All right," he said, his voice level. His calmness was unnerving, not weak, not submissive, but something stronger, something deliberate. "Let's talk about that," he continued, tilting his head slightly. "Since you brought it up." The store seemed to hold its breath, every shopper caught in the stillness of the moment. The storm was coming, but it wasn't the kind anyone expected. Jordan shifted slightly, lowering his basket to the floor with quiet deliberation. The simple act felt intentional, like a signal that he wasn't going anywhere. His presence had a pull to it, drawing in even those who had tried to pretend they weren't listening. His gaze remained steady, locked onto the elderly woman, not with anger, not with hostility, but with something far more unsettling, unwavering certainty. It was enough to make her shift slightly, adjusting the apples in her hands, as if they had suddenly grown heavier. "You said I don't belong here," Jordan began, his voice low, firm. "But let me tell you something about where I come from." Each word was deliberate, carrying the weight of something more than just a reply. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Alabama," he said, pausing just long enough to let the words settle. "He was a sharecropper, worked land he didn't own, broke his back day after day, so his children, his grandchildren, might have a better chance than he did." A silence rippled through the store. People were listening now, really listening. "His father," Jordan continued, his voice even but unshakable. "He was a slave, kidnapped, beaten, sold like cattle to work fields that weren't his. And for what? To help build the very country you're standing in." The woman's lips pressed together tightly, but for once, she didn't have a response. The rest of the store, however, was transfixed. A man near the dairy section, who had been half watching while pretending to scroll through his phone, put it away entirely. An older couple whispered between themselves, but didn't turn away. Even the cashier, who had been checking out a customer, slowed her movements, her eyes flicking toward Jordan. He took a small step forward, not aggressive, just resolute. "My grandfather fought in World War II, he said, his voice gaining quiet strength. Fought for a country that sent him overseas to risk his life only to come home and be treated like a second-class citizen." He let the words hang for a moment, the weight of history pressing against the air between them. Couldn't sit at the same counters. Couldn't drink from the same fountains. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to, because the truth was louder than any shout could ever be. But he stayed. "You know why?" Jordan asked, his voice steady, unwavering. "Because he believed in this country's promise even when it didn't believe in him." The store was silent. Even the quiet hum of the refrigerators seemed to fade into the background. Jordan took a slow breath, his tone shifting, not softer, but deeper, carrying the weight of something real. "And my parents," he continued, "they fought too. Not with guns or fists, but by showing up, every day, working hard, raising me to believe in kindness, in respect, in the power of doing the right thing." He let the words sink in before going on. "My mother's a teacher. She spent her life helping kids, any kids. It never mattered what they looked like. My father, he's a mechanic. The kind of man who'd pull over in the pouring rain to help a stranger with a flat tire. Someone like you, ma'am. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. His words were doing the work. His eyes held hers, unwavering. So you're telling me I don't belong here? That I should go back to Africa? He shook his head, and for the first time, his voice carried something else: sadness. Ma'am, I am as much a part of this country as you are, maybe more, because my family paid for it in blood, sweat and tears. The elderly woman's face reddened, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the bag of apples. She opened her mouth, as if to say something, but nothing came out. Jordan exhaled, then took a step back, not in retreat, but in resolution. I could have walked away, he said, and this time, he wasn't just talking to her, he was talking to all of them. To the entire room. But what good would that do? His eyes swept across the gathered crowd. Ignorance doesn't get better in silence. It's up to all of us to be better than this, to be better than words like those. And just like that, the weight of the moment settled over them all. The weight of Jordan's words didn't just settle, it hung in the air, thick and unshakable. But the story wasn't over yet. The silence stretched, pressing down on everyone in the store. It was the kind of silence that made people hold their breath, unsure of what came next. The elderly woman's face flickered through a range of emotions: anger, embarrassment, and something else, something deeper, a crack in her certainty. She glanced around as if searching for an ally, someone to back her up. None came. Then finally, the spell broke. A middle-aged man in a worn baseball cap stepped forward. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the stillness like a knife. He's right, the man said simply. We've got to be better than this. A quiet ripple passed through the crowd. Near the frozen food aisle, an older woman clutched a box of waffles to her chest and nodded. My dad fought in that same war, she murmured, her voice unsteady. He always said the only color that mattered was the red on the flag. The murmur grew. A young cashier, barely out of her teens, called out from behind her register. I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully, she said, shaking her head in disbelief. Thank you. Jordan didn't move. He didn't need to. The moment was shifting on its own. The elderly woman's grip tightened on the handle of her cart. Her face was pale now, her eyes darting between the faces around her. The fire in her gaze had dimmed, replaced by something more fragile. She swallowed hard. I didn't mean, she started, but the words tangled in her throat. Jordan met her eyes, and this time, his expression had softened. It's not about what you meant, he said, his voice quiet but firm. It's about how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter even more. For the first time, the woman looked like she might actually understand. From the back of the store, someone clapped, slow, hesitant, then another, and another. The sound swelled, not raucous, not over the top, but real. They weren't just clapping for Jordan's words, they were clapping for the way he carried them. For the choice he made. For the reminder that moments like this could go another way. And this time, they had chosen better. The elderly woman hesitated for a moment, her fingers tightening around the handle of her cart. Then, without another word, she turned and wheeled it toward the exit, her steps slower than before. As she disappeared past the automatic doors, a quiet sigh of relief passed through the store. A woman nearby reached out, placing a gentle hand on Jordan's shoulder. Thank you for saying what needed to be said. Jordan exhaled softly, nodding. He picked up his basket again, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the weight of the moment. Sometimes, he murmured, half to himself, it's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure people hear the truth. The crowd began to disperse, the tension dissolving into something else, reflection. Some shoppers exchanged quiet glances, others stood and thought for a few seconds longer before returning to their carts. The moment had passed, but the impact of Jordan's words lingered. As he continued down the aisles, finishing his shopping, the store felt different, quieter, more aware. Even the usual hum of conversation carried a different tone, less idle chatter, more thoughtfulness. At the checkout, the young cashier who had spoken up earlier rang up his items, a soft, almost shy smile on her face. What you said back there, she hesitated, then found her words. It meant a lot. People don't always stand up like that, especially with such grace. Jordan returned the smile, his voice warm. Sometimes, grace is the only way to break through, he said simply. Anger just builds walls. She nodded, considering his words as she handed him his receipt. Outside, The sun had started to set, stretching golden light across the parking lot. The sky was painted in soft shades of amber and violet, a quiet contrast to the tension that had filled the grocery store just moments before. As Jordan walked to his car, something caught his eye. The elderly woman sat in hers, hands gripping the steering wheel. She wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't rummaging through her purse. She was just sitting there, staring ahead, lost in thought. Jordan paused, watching her for a moment. Maybe, just maybe, something had gotten through. For a brief moment, Jordan considered walking over to her, maybe offering one last word. But then he stopped himself. Some lessons take time to settle, and he had already said what needed to be said. That night, as the house settled into its usual quiet, Jordan sat at the kitchen table across from his father. The smell of coffee lingered in the air, the old clock on the wall ticking steadily. His father, a man who had always let his actions speak louder than his words, listened in silence. As Jordan recounted the day's events, he didn't interrupt, didn't react, just folded his hands on the table and took it all in. When Jordan finished, his father exhaled, nodding slowly. "You did the right thing, son," he said at last. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who is watching. People like her. They don't change overnight. But you planted a seed, and that's all you can do. Sometimes plant the seed and let it grow." Jordan sat with that thought for a moment. The encounter had been uncomfortable, yes, frustrating, but necessary. Because ignorance doesn't change unless it's confronted, and silence only lets it fester. Across town, the elderly woman sat alone at her dining table. Her plate sat untouched, the food growing cold. But she didn't notice. She was too busy replaying the words she had heard that afternoon. Each one chipped away at something inside her, cutting through the armor of her assumptions. She thought of her own grandchildren, the world they were growing up in, the lessons she had taught them, and the ones she had failed to teach. And for the first time in a long time she felt something unfamiliar: doubt. In the days that followed, word of what had happened in the grocery store spread. Neighbors talked about Jordan's response, not just the courage it took to speak up, but the way he had done it, with dignity, with grace. It became more than just an incident. It became a lesson, a reminder, that words have power, and that standing up for what's right, especially when it's hardest, is how real change begins. Jordan never sought attention for what he had done. He hadn't spoken up to be praised. He hadn't responded for recognition. But the impact of his words rippled through the community in ways he never expected. Strangers, people he had never met before, approached him in coffee shops, on the street, even in that very same grocery store. Some just offered a nod of respect. Others stopped to share their own stories, stories of prejudice, of resilience, of moments when they wished they had spoken up, or were grateful that someone else did. His quiet stand had sparked conversations that had long been avoided. And the elderly woman, she too, began to change. Change doesn't happen overnight. Old beliefs don't just vanish. But sometimes, a single moment is enough to plant a seed. She never expected his words to stay with her, but they did. The way he stood his ground, not with anger, but with something stronger. She didn't know if she'd ever see him again. But if she did, she hoped she'd have the courage to say the words she couldn't before: "I'm sorry." Moments like these remind us of something powerful: the strength of kindness, the weight of truth, the courage to stand up not with shouting, but with conviction. Because words matter. They can break, or they can heal. They can divide, or they can bring us together. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because together, we can spread messages of hope, understanding, and change, one conversation at a time.